Well, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back myself as well, because my connection just dropped for a second there. That was a little bit traumatic. I'm delighted to welcome Bill Lucas to speak to us today. He is a bit of a big cheese as we get with speakers, which is fantastic. As director of the Centre for Real World Learning and also professor of learning at the University of Winchester, there's going to be so much that we can get in relation to the science, craft and guile of influencing from research to practical action. I'm really excited. I won't read all of Bill's biography, but it's on our website for you to have caught up with. So much of this time is about helping, encouraging, influencing people. So much of our professional life is based around that. I'm looking forward to getting all the benefit of Bill's experience. So I'm going to, without further ado, going to pass over to Bill. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isla. I'll just share my screen. So I'm going to spend 35 minutes, something like that, sharing some of the things that are becoming helpfully clear from science, although obviously health check with anybody using the word science, craft definitely, and guile definitely. When it comes to influencing or persuading other people to do things that they didn't necessarily know they wanted to do. I am trying to think about you in your role as university and health medical librarians, but I'm also thinking of you as adults and as individuals assailed by all sorts of other people trying to get you to do things that they want you to do, or perhaps in your community or family role, from time to time wanting to persuade other members of your family to do things. So it's the end of a morning, so whilst there is some obvious scientific grounding here, I hope also you might find this a bit of fun as well. So as Ida said, I'm based at the University of Winchester, but I also have a role at this institute in Cambridge, which is where I encountered Isla as running giving a version of this talk to PhD students and postdoctoral fellows who are part of this institute, where my role is to help them learn deeper and faster to become more rounded interdisciplinary academics as they go through their learning lives. That's me on Twitter. If you like to tweet, absolutely relaxed. If you want to screenshot, and I'll share the slides anyway with Isla afterwards, if that's of interest to you. Let me start straight in, and then I'll back up and tell you how I'm going to structure this. I'm imagining that most of us still occasionally experience photocopiers that don't work, or that get jams, or that give us confusing error messages. So were you to be at a photocopier and stuck, or perhaps were you to be at a photocopier in this instance and desperate to jump the queue, what might you say to get yourself to the head of that queue? Try these three different examples. So, excuse me, I have 5 pages. May I use the photocopier? Version 1. Excuse me, I have 5 pages. May I use the photocopier because I'm in a rush? Version 2. Excuse me, I have 5 pages. May I use the photocopier because I have to make copies? Now, you'll have noticed that version 1 has no reason, version 2 has a real reason, and version 3 is just a repetition of itself. So you might be interested in Ellen Langer and colleagues' research that showed that the likelihood, and hence the American favor, because Ellen is an American academic, the likelihood of success was highest if the person gave the real reason for wanting to jump the queue. But interestingly, if they gave a fake reason, or a reason that was simply a restatement of the obvious, that was almost as effective. Whereas those who gave no reason at all were only about 2/3 likely to be able to jump the queue. So the first thing I'd want to say to you whenever we're thinking about influencing is always explain, always give a reason. And the better reason, the better. But even if you can't think of a totally compelling reason, come up with something that's going to allow that bit of the human mind that wants to hear the why I'm doing it to respond to you. In the next half an hour or so, I'm going to give you a general introduction to a blend of science, craft, and guile. And then I'm going to give you an example of how I've been trying to use this in my working life. My academic interests straddle health and education, and then we'll open things up for a chat together. One of the most significant and interesting academics and writers in this area is Robert Cialdini, professor and a well-known both popular and academic writer. And what I've just been talking about is one of three things that this book, Influence, Science and Practice, and it would be I'm sure you have it on your shelves, but if you don't, you might like to add it to your shelves. I've just been talking about the way in which we're likely to be more successful if we provide a reason. As we go through, I'm also going to be drawing in a range of different ways about why we like to believe that other people like us are doing this. So the kind of power of proof, and also the enduring need to be consonant in what we say and who we are and the values by which we lead our life. Now, that doesn't really fit in the sciencey bit. That's more a values piece of common sense when we're looking at this. So I asked Isla just to send me a few examples of the kind of day-to-day influence challenges that you might have. And so here they are. You can adapt them and expand on them and ignore them. So maybe some kind of influence upwards, maybe some kind of use of your knowledge about when the best time to have study skills is. Something about gaining access to something that you don't necessarily automatically get invited to, the enduring need to get students to search in anywhere other than just Google, certainly Google Scholar for starters. I'm amazed at how many people don't. And the more conventional kind of, I want this or I need this, how do I make the case? These are just examples. Please forgive me, Isla, if I've misinterpreted the things that you said to me. And most importantly, as you listen to this, think of the kind of things from your lived experience, either as a in your home or community life or at work, that are the real web and weft of what you might like to be influencing other people to do. Let's just start with a bit of throat clearing too here. Changing habits is hard, whether it's the habit of a librarian to go shush, or the habits of those in librarians not to take any notice of that, or in a health context, the challenge that we still have, despite almost everybody knowing the science of infection, routinely to use hand sanitizers, whether gel or water. And just a little loop here, that's a part of my work in my work with Health Foundation and now this Institute Fellows. Look away now, please, if you don't wish to see a naked woman. You have been warned, but a naked woman with a purpose. I'm about to show you now, so look away. This is quite a famous creativity image. Here it is in a book of mine with my friend Guy Claxton for the BBC about a decade ago. And my question to you is, how many of you can see the woman at the window? And most people, not all, will say, yes, I can. And then I will say, and I'm about to say, oh, no, you can't. What you can see is the gap between a cat, a shelf with a pot plant that looks a little bit like hair, with a curtain that gives a curve in the back, with a wine glass, and then with some undergarments in the lovely Cambridge or Winchester sunshine. Not today, I have to say. It's pouring with rain here in Winchester. So why on earth am I showing you that? Well, because if I now ask you, so can you, now you know rationally that there is no woman at the window, but just a kind of gap between objects, can you now see the objects rather than the woman? And most people still see the woman, even though at the objective rational level, they know that she is not there, nor ever has she been. So our habits, even if they're wrong, can very, very quickly get formed. And once we've seen things the way we see things, it's ever so easy to get stuck in that and ever so easy to get us out of the way in which we're seeing the world. This is something I've been using and developing initially with friends at the Health Foundation and now with this institute when it comes to improving healthcare, where we've identified a set of habits of mind which are particularly helpful when making any act of improvement. And you will notice that one whole section is about influencing, because anyone trying to improve anything, I'm going to argue, needs to be in charge of their own emotions and able to read others, empathic, needs to be facilitative, not just tell others, because others may not know that they want to do what you want them to do. And of course, need to be comfortable with conflict, because inevitably you're going to be perhaps asking people to do things that don't make them necessarily very comfortable. If you wanted to read a shorter version of that, then in the BMJ Quality and Safety, there's a 4-page summary of that piece. And just an example of the way influence works, through the authority of the Health Foundation, this found its way into the Scottish Chief Medical Officer's report a few years back, and from there has now garnered proof of concept and social proof in a whole range of areas. This is actually Ireland, and it's now featured as part of their professional development of medics in Ireland, just for an example. So now let's move into the talk proper. Let me give you a little bit more sciencey person-to-person stuff, and then I'll give you a model by which you might apply this in terms of an influence map. Then a little bit more of the wider science again. Then I'll just whiz through a case study from my own work, and then we'll open up this for Zoom conversation. Everything that I say is prefaced by a reminder that what we're talking about here is fundamentally a values-driven approach. So I'm not talking about tricks or even scurrilous tricks, although they do exist and salespeople use them on us, and I'll point to a few as we go through, because my strong belief, and the evidence would support this, is that we do better when we influence people according to what feels to be true to them about their understanding of us and who we are and what we do and what we value. Of course, this is not new, colleagues, and you may have some version of this on your shelves. If not, again, you may like to. So we're now many moons ago in the 4th century BC with Aristotle reminding us that rhetoric, a kind of synonym, if you like, for an aspect of persuasion or influence, requires us to be just what I was talking about, the ethos, that's the values bit. It requires us to use pathos, that's the emotional, intelligent connections that we make, our understandings of others around us, and it requires us to use evidence and data. And there's nothing new under the sun, really, is there? And most effective influencers manage to combine these different aspects. Now, there's a really nice principle here, which this couple of zebra very nicely illustrate for us, and it's the you scratch my back and I'll scratch your back principle, otherwise known as the reciprocity principle. Let me give you an example of where you may wittingly or unwittingly have been the recipient of this. Less so these days, but it used to be all the rage at the end of a meal, just before, and I mean a meal in a restaurant, just before the moment where you were going to be invited to pay the bill and possibly give a tip, that you would be given a small present in the shape of an after-eight mint or some such. Why on earth, after a delicious meal, would you want to contaminate your palate with a semi-cheap mint such as an after-eight mint? I actually like them, but you can see where I'm going. And the answer is, by giving you something, you're kind of conferring a reciprocal response. If you think evolutionarily, it would have been about sharing food, probably, or sharing shelter. We share with you so that then you share with us. So the reciprocity principle in our lives can have a very, very simple expression, as little as you in your library noticing when somebody else just needs a bit of care and sliding up to them and offering them that cup of tea or cup of coffee. You're not knowingly saying, oh, by the way, I'd like you to do that when I'm feeling a bit down too. But actually, of course, that's probably what they're picking up. There's a second thing here, just in this kind of human scale, human to human interaction when it comes to influence, and that is the way we issue suggestions. If I say to you, I think you ought to, almost however I complete the sentence, then there's a little resistant gene in you that's probably going to say, well, who are you to tell me? Or I don't want to, thanks very much. Whereas if I say, you might like to, that's got a completely different flavor. It's still a piece of advice, but it lands completely differently. If I say to you, you might like to, I'm respecting you as an adult. I'm giving you permission to say, and by the way, I might like not to, Bill. Thanks very much. So it's leaving you in a land of possibility, of agency, of choice. So a really simple thing is whenever you're giving feedback or advice, rather than telling them, use this phrase, this clause, you might like to, in your conversation with them. One of the best known examples of the effect or the power of influencing is social proof. Here, a laughing audience will suggest to somebody who doesn't see the joke that it might be funny. It's why radio shows use canned laughter. It's why if you're a sports watcher and if you were watching anything during the pandemic, you may have found it curious to have been watching the naked football match or cricket match or whatever, stripped of the adornment of its crowd noises, all indicating to you whether that was a good pass or not a good pass. We're very, very influenced by that. A restaurant example here would be, and you often see this on American bars, that one of the glasses on the bar is full of dollar bills and larger, with the implication being that anybody who comes to this bar not only buys a drink from the bartender, but also leaves a tip for the bartender. Lots of ways in which this can be used, and we'll come on to that as I go through this. Now, in terms of the architecture of how one might organize one's life, it's really helpful whenever you're trying to persuade anybody to do anything, not necessarily in this kind of rather presenty, slidey kind of way, but just to think maybe in a kind of 6 degrees of influence sort of way, how much influence do I have on this person whose mind I'm trying to change? That's the axis that goes from the top to the bottom. And how far away am I from them? Would they take any notice of me? Am I in a different part of the organization? Am I a very lonely person? Lowly, sorry, I may be lonely too, when it comes to my relationships with them. And the goal in anything, whatever it is you're trying to influence anyone to try and do, is of course to try and move up towards the top right. And often we're moving, when I say moving, not literally moving, but we're finding connections that enable us to get to the person that we're trying to get to. So back to one of those earlier Isla questions about how you influence those above you. Well, probably not by writing them an email out of the blue, but finding both social and hierarchical and meeting attending and interest-led routes to get closer to them, such that your influence might be a little bit more successful. When it comes to influencing at scale, that's to say changing people's mind, there is a classic change curve, Everett Rogers, actually thinking about agricultural innovation in the States, and known as the diffusion of innovations. That means how does new thinking get spread around the system? And it's a bell curve, a rather overly neat one. Well, all bell curves look like this, don't they? Which implies that you need to focus on the early adopters and the innovators. Well, that's commonly the case, and that's true. And then you grind your way through until you finally achieved the laggards coming on side. Actually, I've never been convinced that that's a terribly worthwhile way of proceeding, and probably thereby madness lies, because it's the laggards and the late majority who are such hard work. And maybe that isn't a helpful way of framing this. I particularly like Malcolm Gladwell's idea of the tipping point. He uses the example of the American subway, which almost overnight managed to get rid of its graffiti problem by finding just a little tiny thing that could make a very big difference very quickly. And this was the prompt and immediate and efficient removal of graffiti, because graffiti was a kind of image for scariness, for a system that was not really looked after, possibly not safe, possibly somewhere where people like me didn't want to go. And of course, it turned it round. And Gladwell's observation is that actually this is not a bell curve, but this is a sudden tipping point. And I think actually, interestingly, in the pandemic, it's the wearing of masks, I think, was part of that Malcolm Gladwell view of the way we change our views about things. Gladwell goes on to suggest that there are three very different kinds of archetypes when it comes to the roles that we can play. Connectors, mavens, and salespeople. And he then describes them thus. And it's interesting perhaps to reflect that, of course, how we influence is going to be a function of our personality as well. So there are the people who are at the center of networks and constantly say, oh, you must talk to X or you must talk to Y. And then there are the mavens, and actually quite a lot of my librarian friends I would put into this idea, who are deep in a realm of ideas, and can sometimes that can sometimes be both a power of strength and a challenge. And then there are those who are more salesy, who just love to share their ideas with passion, and that works sometimes, but of course it depends. And of course, no one is any one of those things. We're all aspects of all of those things, aren't we? Let's have a little bit more science then. Another idea, another Cialdini idea, is the idea of authority. Not just that the authority seems to be conferred by being very tall, although by the way, there is experimental data to say that taller people get their way more often, or even that silver hair in a man might confer some kind of gravitas. Actually, there's evidence that it possibly does. But more, I'm thinking about here in the idea of authority, the authority that comes with the kind of things that librarians and academics and anyone who's become experienced at something might have. And so my question here would be just inviting you to think how you can use your knowledge. Your knowledge, for example, in that question about, for goodness sake, use something other than Google. Your knowledge of 2 or 3 simple other alternative search engines that somebody might use. Your knowledge as a librarian of the critical thinking required to distinguish between reliable and less reliable sources, or the knowledge that you will have about effective searching and the kind of categorizing and taxonomies that are the web and weft of a librarian and indeed of an academic. Another principle here that might interest you is the principle of mere exposure. This is the idea, and I'm going to illustrate this by way of an example. And the example is, think of a time when you moved house or flat, and you discovered somewhere, either in a room or in a corner of a cupboard, something you didn't like. Now, forgive me if you're an aficionado of 60s wallpaper, but let's say you're not, for the sake of this debate. And your first thought, therefore, on seeing that wallpaper is going to be, that has got to go. Now, interestingly, and we know this from Robert Zahonk's work, that actually that feeling of that's got to go quite quickly. In about a month or so, you may find yourself saying to your partner, that wallpaper, you know what? It's beginning to grow on me. And you've fallen foul of the mere exposure effect. So one of the things we know about influence is that without being abusive of your power, simply giving people safe opportunities to experience something is more likely to lead them to think that this is a good thing. So if you like, the proverb, which has temporarily escaped my mind, but will come back in a second, about exposure. Never mind. Oh yeah, familiarity breeds contempt. is the proverb. And actually the truth of it scientifically is familiarity breeds content. So just hold that in your growing repertoire of influence tools and techniques. And by the way, as we're listening, I'd love it if you'll be thinking, well, of course, yeah, I didn't call it that, but yes, I used that, or that worked really well when I tried it on person X or person Y. When we're trying to persuade people to do something, we have a choice. It's quite a binary choice. We either point out what's not going well. This is classically called gap analysis by Kurt Lewin and others. Or, and here's appreciative inquiry, the idea of David Cooper-Ridder and Suresh Srivastava, that you get more buy-in if you start by looking at where people are doing things well already. Interestingly, in health and education research, I'm increasingly finding that appreciative inquiry and positive deviance, as in finding and understanding what people are doing this really well are doing, is a very fruitful part of improvement science. So are you the kind of person who automatically says, well, good looks like this and we're over here and that's a yawning gap? Or are you the kind of person who says, I think I know where I want to get to here. Let's look around in my institution, in my library, in my faculty, and identify and celebrate those people who are already doing things well and learn from them. It is the second of those two, I think the evidence suggests, is more likely to be helpful if you're trying to influence people to your way of thinking. Now, there's a fellow, David Guile, who I'll give you a reference at the bottom of this slide in a second, who came up with this really interesting formula. It's about the only thing he's contributed to this debate, but my goodness me, I personally find this helpful. And the formula is this: D times V times F helps you to overcome R, where R is resistance to change, D is dissatisfaction, V is vision of what you'd like it to be, and F, slightly clunky this, is first steps towards getting to that vision. Now, many of the people who try to persuade us to do things in life have two of those three things. They have the vision thing, and they're an operational person too, so they can say, and on Monday, let's take step one towards that. Well, that won't work for those of us who aren't persuaded that we have a problem in the first place. Or maybe they're the kind of person who can articulate the dissatisfaction, what's wrong, and give us the vision, but they leave us hanging because it's not clear how one can operationalize it. Or maybe the third variant, they can articulate the dissatisfaction, tell you operationally what you need to do, but leave you stone cold because you don't know how it fits within the bigger picture. And if you want to have a little bit look at that, then there's a nice piece in that well-known journal, OD Practitioner, where you can just get under the skin of this, I think, very, very useful way of framing influence. I've just written a very short piece with a couple of colleagues, which if you wanted to, you could dig out. But I think the Spot the Dog cartoon makes the point much more effectively than I have. I've taught Spot to whistle. I can't hear him whistling. I said I taught him to whistle, not that he had learned. That's the key thing, isn't it? Influencing is a two-way process. We need to be alive to the feedback that tells us whether what we've been said has landed or has not landed. And if it hasn't landed, make sure we do it in some different way. There was a period about a decade ago when direct mail suddenly latched onto the idea of an experiment that showed that personalization helps. So if I just get a dear potential donor letter, I chuck it in the bin. But if I get a dear Bill letter, and of course, this is what Google's algorithms does all the while, when it throws up our buying habits as we're searching for something, unless we persuaded students or practitioners to use Google Scholar, for example, personalization really helps because it feels like we're being talked to and treated as an individual. And of course, you'll be well aware how some of this has been operationalized for 10 years now in the behavioral insights team. And there have been some interesting successes in that regard, I think. And if you don't know it, there's another book that I'm sure you have on your shelf, but the idea of nudging people by being smart in the way that we use stuff. So we can see how this is beginning to work. For example, when you flip the default setting on something, that the assumption is that I want to donate my organs, or another really clear principle is of a clear information when we're making choices here, whether it's an energy tariff or a mobile phone tariff. I think we all, but librarians included, might use this when we're trying to, for example, argue the merits of different search engines, for example. Dentists and doctors and many in healthcare have learnt how the consistent, personalized prompts will get more people to attend rather than to miss their appointments. And many of us will have been in the days when we went to hotels in a hotel room where the hotel is clearly conscious about the planet and about not literally necessarily washing your towels every day. Which of these two messages do you think might be the more effective way of persuading you to do that? An appeal to your altruism, or 9 out of 10 guests choose to reuse their towels? Well, I'm sorry to say it's the second of those, because, and here's the power of social proof, I don't want to be thought of as the one of 10 people who are somehow uncaring or stroppy or lazy or something else, or suspicious about the way that the hotel simply wants to save money on its laundry bill, that I'm not actually going to do this. Excuse me. Right. Nearly there. Let me just give you a very, very quick example of something in my own work where I hope you'll feel in a number of ways I've been trying to put these things into practice, although not often in a logical, explicit way. It's easy to look back on things, isn't it, and see what might have been going on. So, as a parent, as an educator, I believe that creativity is really important. And I notice that on my children's school timetable, it doesn't appear. So as an academic and as somebody who's trying to change behavior, what do I do? Well, unsurprisingly, I start to think about how this fits in my view of the world. And I come up with a sense that, well, once upon a time, we thought that the world was flat and that a ship would sail off the edge and come to an untimely end being bitten by a dragon en route. And now, of course, we know that the Earth is round. And that's an image for learning. Once upon a time, we thought that children were little vessels to be filled up with knowledge, and that's all we needed to do. And of course, now we realize that there are many other concepts, capabilities, dispositions that we want our young people to have if they're going to be able to flourish in a tricky world. So with that image in mind, that's my kind of big picture vision. I'm looking around, and actually it was my privilege to work with Ken Robinson for a bit. And this, if you don't know it, if you're a parent and interested in creativity, this is the most watched TED Talk of all time. And there's a terrific RSA animated version of it. And Ken Robinson is an authority figure on this and chaired an important advisory committee 20 plus years ago, but still no change. 10 years on, I found myself in receipt of some grant money and set with my research team us the task of coming up with a model of creativity that would be acceptable in schools, and then empirically looking at ways in which we could see if teachers can teach it, and then if they can assess it. It worked, and then this rolled out into a wider OECD project. The commissioner of that research, Creativity, Culture and Education, became a partner, and our opportunity to show how this works has landed in schools, one on the left here in London, one on the right there in Sydney, and actually in now hundreds of schools across the world, so that our social proof, our proof of concept, is that in different cultural settings, from Chile to Norway, from Perth to Peru, it is possible for schools to see that it is that you can integrate creativity and creative thinking in school. We then took a overtly populist, so think about our influence map. We reckon that we need to get to parents here, because they're the voters who ultimately influence curricula and certainly influence schools. So here, those of you who know the Willie Russell film and stage play, Educating Rita, will see that we've nicked the idea, and we imagine that Ruby is Rita's granddaughter. By the way, if you've not got this on your library shelf, it's a good general interest book, and it became rather popular and made a modest influence. And we're now beginning, I'm now going back a couple of years to work with positive deviance. This is my appreciative inquiry in action. And I've luckily struck up a friendship and a professional relationship with Australia in general and the state of Victoria in particular, who I've now been working with over the best part of a decade, who now specify what creativity looks like in schools, so it's no longer vague. They've even come up with, and I managed to work with the local newspaper, the Melbourne Age, examples for parents and employers of what these kind of creativity thinking tests, which they're the first in the world to run, might look like. And then a research-based practitioner guide. And here, deliberately looking at people who might give it a bit of clout. So here I'm drawing on authority. And some of these, they may not necessarily be household names to you, but in my world, they're rather important, allowing us to call upon that as we move forward. And most recently of all, this is becoming the kind of gold standard academic test that PISA rolls out along with English, Maths and Science. Won't be 2021, it'll be 2022, and I've been chairing it. And I've been contributing and eventually co-authoring a commission here in England. And now we have a public resource called the Creativity Exchange, which is now showing at scale and at quality what teachers can do in schools near you. Now, of course, was it always like that? Did I go into it thinking, which one of these, this repertoire of insight of influencing tactics will I use? Of course I didn't. Was I aware of them? Yes. Do I use them actively in my life? Most definitely. Do I sometimes not even notice that I'm doing it? Yeah. That's what happens when you move from something which is explicit to something which is tacit. And that is, of course, a journey towards expertise as we become more effective influencers. I hope you spotted in that little mini case study examples of social proof, of the use of Gleicher's formula, of authority, of an influence map, because I had Australia on it, of clear explanations, of reciprocity, of finding an accelerated tipping point through a commission, and of mere exposure by working at scale with schools till they might finally say, well, it's a fair cop, we give in. Now, thanks so much for listening. That's just a little over 35 minutes. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and look forward to a Zoom conversation with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bill. There was so much in there for us to take in. I think there's a lot to chew over, but there have been questions that have been coming through, and a little bit of chair's prerogative. Obviously, I've got a lot of questions myself, but I'll just sort of work through some of them. Thing that was occurring to me in terms of that reciprocity aspect. Sometimes people get in contact with us saying, can you send us this article? Can you get this thing for me? How much can you plan, and how much needs to be an ad hoc reaction to, oh, they've just asked me for a favor, maybe I can get back. Here's the article. I wonder if we could meet for a chat about. How spontaneous do you need to be, or can you actually plan these things?
I think that's a very good question. I think people smell a rat if you pass them a very large gift called favor. Watch out, I'm going to ask for something in return. But I think people are actually quite good at spotting where kind librarians regularly offer you some help, which is a little bit more than what is technically necessary. And it is conferring a likelihood that they're going to invite you or look positively on something that you want from them. So I actually think, and as a parent, I've often thought this. My eldest is 13, youngest is 17. And I remember particularly with the 30-year-old, when it came to being persuaded that I might pick him up from a party at some rather too late hour in my nighttime, I would find it quite easy to go into some reciprocity trading and saying, and just remind me what it is you're going to do. You see that pile of washing up over there? So I think, you can over egg this. And I think providing you're true to yourself, I think people kind of know what's going on. And actually, I think it's as I was trying to explain, I think it's a fundamental human kind of, when we're on the step, it's kind of an evolutionary, very natural, the give and get thing. It's a very natural thing that kind human beings do.
Lucy says, I wonder if Bill has any tips for how to build these kinds of phrases "you might like to" into your everyday speech. It seems a little more complex to remember than something like trying to train yourself to use gender neutral pronouns, that sort of thing. So, but changing your language, personal changes, is difficult to say anything. I wonder if you've got any thoughts around that.
Very good question. Did you say Lucy?
Lucy.
Thanks, Lucy. In the fellowship development groups that my colleague Fiona Reid and I run for this institute, we actually have a kind of protocol which we use to help PhD and postdoctoral students learn. And it is a bit clunky to begin with. The protocol goes like this. You invite them to share an issue first in no more than a sentence. So let's say, let's take one of your examples, Isla. I would like students to use more than Google as their search mechanism. And then providing that's clear, so it might require a clarifying question, but I think that one doesn't. Then you say, okay, in the small group of 3 or 4 or 5, I want you each to offer Isla a "you might like to" suggestion. And all Isla's going to do as you offer them that is to say, thank you. So I might say, Isla, you might like to set your toolbar to Google Scholar. And all you say, Isla, even if you think that's a bit simple, level 1, you say, thank you, Bill. And then somebody else says, well, I might like you to sign up to database X or database Y. And all you can say is thank you. Or you might like to get involved in a site like ResearchGate, where you're going to be more actively curating what you have to offer, and all you're going to say is thank you. And so the essence is mere exposure and the power of repetition. And I think sometimes when you're learning a new phrase bank, and coaches would say this to you, you just have to practice it. And it's a bit like it's the first time you use a new word, isn't it? I remember I studied A-level English, and I remember in my A-level English class, one of the other members of the class, I can remember her vividly because she was a friend called Claire, who said something was very apposite to the poet's state of mind. I'd never heard the use, didn't know what apposite was. My goodness me, I thought that was clever and interesting. So then in the quiet of my own bedroom, as I was scribbling my essays, I was being very apposite. Or I need another word for appropriate. And then gradually it becomes your word. I think that's like the first time. So it's like just recognizing that the first time you use something, it sounds a bit clunky. So just give yourself safe space to play with it. And don't beat yourself up if you slip into command territory rather than, permission territory. Thanks for that question, Lucy.
Great stuff. Stephen's wondering about influencing people who are in a more powerful position when you're in a service provider role. You touched on that before about if you're generally seen as a useful person, people will be more likely to do something for you as well as with you. But have you got any sort of pointers around that?
So I think influencing upwards is a life skill that we all need to acquire. The easiest stage of that upwards influencing is the next one up the command, if it's a command, and many organizations, even if they pretend not to, are commands. And there it's about building a relationship, isn't it? Establishing a culture where you give and receive feedback, and it's a two-way relationship. Encouraging a culture where if your line manager isn't immediately asking you for your opinions, you are beginning to offer your opinions, or even asking for, or maybe asking questions like, I'm really interested in whatever the organization is discussing. What would the most helpful way in which I could? So it's kind of like a version of "you might like to," and it's asking, you're not asking whether, you're asking how. So I think sometimes it's just a very slight tweak of the language that you use. So not is it appropriate for somebody so lowly as me to offer you a great and mighty my opinion, but I'm actually a sentient being here, and I have views, and I do care. And so what would be the best method of me offering my opinion? Now that works at the relational level, the next level up. I think once you get out of that, you need deep guile and cunning. So you need to find who you can get to, who might be able to have a quiet word about, or drop a note to, or occasionally just being, and we teach our fellows to do this, sometimes a really carefully thought out email written to somebody important, if they're very important, prefaced possibly by a phone call, if they have a PA or an assistant or something, EA, that says, I'd be so grateful if you could ask person X to expect an email from person Y, me, about X, and make sure that the X is something that they care about or they're interested in. And that's just allowing you to cut through the noise of it's otherwise going to kind of hit the cutting room floor. Sorry, I'm mixing my metaphors there. So I think as many, and there are cross-cutting organizations and groups in organizations, aren't there? Whether they're societies or professional associations or interest groups. So again, I think using the social opportunities that tend to be less hierarchical, but not abusing them. There's nothing worse, is there, than when you are in that position of power, having a quiet, oh, that we could do this these days, quiet, let's imagine us having a quiet glass of wine with a colleague and somebody overly earnestly interrupting us, knocking our wine over to get that all-important opinion, brackets important to them, to us. So there's something about just understanding how the receiver can best receive it, as well as how the transmitter can best transmit it. And that Spot the Dog cartoon, I think, it's often thinking, how might this land for them? And how would I know if it had been heard? And sometimes there are culture survey type methods, and sometimes the organizations ask questions. So definitely, Isla, no simple answer on that very complex it's quite political question as well. Good question.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. Slight change of tack. Does the influencing change with the changing nationality of the person? We work in highly multicultural organizations, whether in the NHS or in universities. And I think it's Rick who's asking, he's at a conference earlier this week when we were discussing different cultures being less or more direct, and that alters their understanding.
Wow, Rick, that's such a good question, and you don't know it, but I'm in a dialogue with some educators in Shanghai at the moment, and I'm preparing a presentation for a colloquium that I'm contributing to on Monday morning at a very early English hour, and it's a really curious thing because I know enough to know about what my stereotypes about are cultures of respect. Which would go in my favor because I'm a professor and they're not, or the person I'm dealing with, and B, cultures of respect that would go from me to them in understanding a more didactic tradition of teaching, a less questioning view of the teacher in terms of not to know an answer in a Chinese question might be an admission of weakness, whereas in a British classroom it might be an admission of open-mindedness and a willingness to listen. So, Rick, this is something I'm wrestling with at the moment, and I found myself moving more slowly as my strategy, trying to pick up luckily we've had Zoom calls, so at least I've been able to see the body language. But then just out of the blue this morning, I got an email which said, thank you, Professor Lucas, for your timely response, which if I was reading between the lines, I'd really bust a neck to get it out overnight to them. And then here is our response, and that was phrased as if I might phrase to a colleague, a bit like you might like to. And I looked at the response, and the response was move slide 1 to slide 5, and subheading here should be, so Rick, I'm all over the place on this, and I don't know what the answer is, except that I know that cultures really react to this differently. And I think the thing that I'm least confident about, and I'd love to hear your view, is the whole deference authority bit of this. because I just don't know what I don't know sometimes. So I tend to like when the guide dogs are being trained, the guide dog is trained to sit at the edge of the road, and if it hears a signal that it doesn't know what it means, it's trained just to sit there and wait on the grounds that that will give its owner a chance to work out whether it was a dangerous car or not. So I think my response tends to be a bit like a guide dog and just sit and wait it out so that I don't make a kind of stunningly, awkwardly, culturally illiterate response. But I'd love to know what your view is.
Do you have an answer, Rick? Do you have an answer to your own question?
No, I don't have an answer, but it is very interesting to know that even you kind of struggle with this, and it is, as Ina said, we work in such multicultural environments. The influencing, whether it's for students or colleagues or academics that we're working with, we kind of need to pick up on these subtleties. And when when you said about would you like to, that's a really interesting approach, but it's where exactly those kind of phrases we were talking about just 2 days ago, saying that in certain cultures, where they are very direct, that kind of maybe sort of less direct approach, they don't really understand as being in the same way we do. They would just see, oh well, that's optional then. Oh, I might like to, might not to.
Yes.
So yeah, no, I don't have an answer, but it's interesting. It's something we definitely need to think about, I think.
One thing on email, which I find easier sometimes on these matters, because you don't have to do it in real time, you can stop and think about it, is interim summaries of what I think we've agreed. So what I'm now doing more of is saying to Isla, it's not you I'm dealing with, saying to blank name, because it's private. So just to check my understanding, I think what we've agreed is, and then it kind of doesn't matter whether she comes back with a subject, verb, object, or a more gentle version of a sentence, because I'm at least more confident, Rick, that I've understood what it is that she's hoping I'll do.
And absolutely, that's something I've started doing myself, actually, trying to do regular recaps of exactly what we've agreed to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which isn't a bad life strategy anyway.
So many complex conversations that just regrouping is a good thing. Tall and grey people.
Yes, the teach back technique, as you say, Rebecca, exactly.
Yeah, tall and grey has more influence. Gender, what factor does that lead? Thatcher lowered her voice. What does the research say about gender and influencing?
I don't know. Wouldn't say I have anything strong to contribute on that, except some noticings. So I have some noticings from the world of where I've noticed things haven't gone as I had perhaps intended them. So they're less about whether Thatcher lowered her voice. Mind you, I think that works quite well anyway, sometimes for all of us. I don't think I have anything generalizable about gender, but would love to hear colleagues on this call who could suggest things either that I could read or that they've learnt or they feel about this. So I've pretty much been dealing at the level of population and generality. Now, there's an invitation in the chat if anybody would like to suggest something.
Brilliant. That's maybe something for us to look into again.
I like, I'm not sure, forgive me, I'm not sure who college librarian is, but I like that idea about, pretty good, which we might use to mean not great. Yeah. That's nice.
Yeah, the different interpretations.
I mean, classically in this area, but it's a little bit, it's in the early days of the language we use to describe effective women as being either aggressive or assertive, betray some of the unhelpful male thinking, I think, about these matters. But as you can tell, it's not an area that I feel I'm strong on contributing.
But it's an interesting one. The nature of our profession is highly weighted towards lots of women in library roles. Science, people in science.
the concept of creativity, not suggesting that people in science are not creative in any way, shape or form. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just wondering about the sort of the word creativity. A lot of what we do is about helping them do searches of the literature to find the right papers that are talking about the right thing in terms of creativity and the language that they need to be using. I wonder if there's if you've got any insights into whether scientists and language versus scientists and creativity in other ways. As I say, I don't want to get into a horrible generalization of scientists are not creative. I know they are, but the language creativity side.
No. In terms of the search protocol, I teach people to stick the word myth into whatever they're searching, because it'll flush out the other side. And so if you want to take some of the myths about creativity, what one is that you're born creative or not, and there's a growing evidence base to say that that's largely not true, not entirely, of course there's a genetic element. Another is that creativity is uniquely the preserve of the arts, and there's actually really good empirical evidence that that's precisely wrong. The number of Nobel mathematicians and scientists who explicitly describe the process of creativity, if you like, their Archimedes eureka moments, are legion. So there are lots of examples there. So that's quite an easy one to overcome empirically, just by pointing to a lot of examples. I think that's where I'd start. And my own view is, and I think there's growing belief of and evidence for this in schools, is that creativity has a place in every subject of the school curriculum and every aspect of our life. And it kind of depends what you define creativity as. And if in my 5-dimensional model, it's a combination of your imagination, of your curiosity and inquisitiveness, of your willingness to keep going when things get tricky, as they will, and your ability to collaborate with others, and also your recognition that it's a learnable habit of mind that you can practice, back to the mere exposure idea.
Yeah. We're just coming up to 12 o'clock. There's lots of sort of chat in the chat, but in terms of specific questions, I'm not pulling out any further. College librarian saying there's a bit of tension between polite, flowery language we might use to influence people, which dilutes the actual meaning. We're so busy being nice and friendly that we fail to actually get the message across, perhaps. I wonder if that's a failing.
Yes, I'd be reluctant to generalize, but I think there's never any. I think being true to yourself as an individual is the most important thing that you can do as a teacher, as an academic, as a librarian, as a parent. But I think also recognizing that there are techniques that we can all use that may feel a bit clunky the first, second, and third time we use them, but that are worth keeping an open mind about and just seeing which land for us. And so all I hope I've offered you is a smorgasbord of possible things that you might try. And success for me would be if you thought, A, I wasn't a complete idiot, and B, you try one of them and then adapt it and if it works for you.
Well, Bill, my goodness, we have hugely appreciated your talk today. Thank you so much. As I say, there was lots of chat. I'm sure there will be lots of thinking and stuff going on. I know that from my point of view, sort of thinking about nudge, thinking about that exposure just raises an awareness of alternatives and different routes. And you might like to go down that you are a grown-up, you can judge that. Come back to me. Those are the things that are sticking in my head, and I've got lots of book ideas to increase the library shelves as well. So that's many of them have Lucas in the list of authors as well, which is fantastic. Thank you so much indeed. We really, really appreciate your time, and the fact that the presentation will go on our website as well. Very much appreciated. So there would be an audible round of applause. The downside of Zoom is obviously lacking in that sense. But thank you so much for your time this morning.
My total pleasure. Thanks very much for listening, although you had no alternative. So bye-bye.
They might like to listen again.
You might like to, or you might like not to. Take care.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you.